The county hearing room was already standing room only when James Whitfield walked in carrying a fence post across his shoulder. People had come from across the township. A few had brought notebooks. The county clerk had opened the overflow room and set up a speaker, but most people stayed in the main chamber, pressed against the walls. Word had spread that the county zoning board, at the urging of a developer named Vincent Collier, had rezoned James Whitfield's 73-acre farm from agricultural to commercial, and issued an order requiring the removal of all farm structures within 60 days. The 73 acres sat directly in the path of Collier's proposed outlet mall. Most people already knew how rezoning cases ended. When a county board rezones your land and a developer is waiting, the structures come down. That's how commercial development works. But James Whitfield didn't look like a man whose barn was 60 days from a bulldozer, because the fence post on his shoulder had initials carved into it, and the date read 1937. The security guard stopped him. "Sir, you can't bring a— Is that a fence post?" James lowered it from his shoulder. The post was about 4 feet long, grey cedar, weathered and cracked but solid. Near the top, 2 sets of initials were carved deep into the wood, JW and NW. Below them, the date, 1937. "Evidence," James said. His attorney, a land use specialist named Frank Petrov, handed the guard a document. The guard read it, looked at the post, and stepped aside. James carried it inside and leaned it against the defense table. Soil still clung to the base. Across the hearing table, the zoning board's attorney and Vincent Collier's team occupied 6 chairs. Collier himself, trim, grey-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than James's truck, sat beside an architect with rolled blueprints. Collier looked at the fence post and turned to his attorney. "He brought lumber to a zoning hearing," his attorney shrugged. Vincent Collier had developed 14 commercial properties across 3 counties. His outlet mall project would bring 12,200 construction jobs and $8 million in annual tax revenue. The county board had approved the rezoning 5-1 after a presentation that included economic projections, traffic studies, and a rendering of the completed mall with families walking past storefronts. The Whitfield farm was the last holdout. 3 other farms in the zone had already sold. Collier had offered James $1.2 million, triple the agricultural value. James declined. Collier raised to $1.5 million. James declined again. The rezoning was the next step. Under commercial zoning, farm structures became non-conforming and subject to removal. Without the barn, the equipment sheds, and the livestock facilities, the farm couldn't operate. James would have no choice but to sell. At a press event, Collier had said, "This project brings jobs and revenue." One farmer standing in the way of 1,200 jobs. That's not a property rights issue. That's a progress issue. The Whitfield family had farmed the 73 acres since 1934, when James's grandfather, Joseph Whitfield, purchased the land during the Depression for back taxes. Joseph built the first fence in 1937 with his brother Martin. They carved their initials at the corner post, JW and MW, and drove it into the ground with a sledgehammer. The farm had never been zoned commercial. It had been agricultural since before the county had a zoning code. That was the key. The county's zoning code had been adopted in 1968, a year when the Whitfield farm was already 34 years old. The barn had been standing for 31 years. The equipment shed had been built in 1952. The livestock pens dated to 1927. The fence, with its carved corner post, had been in the ground since 1937. Every structure on the property predated the zoning code by decades. Frank Petrov had handled 3 similar cases in his career. Each one hinged on the same legal principle: you cannot retroactively apply a new law to something that was legal when it was built. It was one of the oldest protections in American property law, and one of the most frequently ignored by developers with connections to county boards. Frank drove out to the Whitfield property on a Saturday. James met him at the gate. They walked the entire perimeter together. The farm was modest. 73 acres of rolling pasture with a creek along the eastern edge, a barn near the center, and an equipment shed near the road. The livestock pens were well maintained. The fencing was in good repair. There was nothing about the property that suggested neglect or structural risk. Frank stopped at the southwest corner. The fence post was cedar, gray with age but solid. The carved initials, JW and MW, were deep enough that 90 years of weather hadn't worn them away. The date, 1937, was still clearly readable. "Your grandfather carved these?" Frank asked. "Both of them did," James said. "Joseph and Martin Whitfield, brothers. They built the fence together the year they bought the land. My father told me they spent 3 days on it. Quarreled about the spacing the whole time." Frank ran his thumb across the carved letters. The cedar was smooth under his fingers, polished by wind and rain over nearly 9 decades. "This is your case," Frank said. "This post proves the farm was here before zoning existed. Everything else follows from that." But James pulled the post himself, carefully, the following Tuesday. He wrapped it in canvas and drove it to Frank's office. Frank photographed it from every angle, measured the carving depth, and sent a section to the State Forestry Department for dendrochronological dating. The lab results came back in 10 days. The cedar was dated to 1935 to 1938. The tool marks were consistent with hand carving using 1930s-era chisels. Preservation condition was consistent with heartwood cedar that had been partially submerged in well-drained soil. Exactly the conditions at the corner post position. Frank also pulled county records. The zoning ordinance was adopted on March 14, 1968, by a 4-1 vote of the county board. The single dissenting vote came from a commissioner named Hargrove, who had argued that the ordinance should include a grandfather clause for existing farms. He was outvoted. The ordinance as written contained no explicit grandfather protection, but state law did. State Statute 447201, passed in 1974, established that pre-existing non-conforming uses, including agricultural uses, could not be eliminated by local zoning changes without either just compensation or proof that the use constituted a public health hazard. No one had offered James compensation. No one had alleged a health hazard. The county had simply rezoned his land and ordered his buildings removed, as if 88 years of continuous farming could be erased by a 5-1 vote. Frank filed the defense. He attached the dendrochronology report, the county zoning ordinance date, the state statute, and a sworn statement from James describing the history of the fence post. Collier's attorneys responded with a motion to dismiss. The judge denied it. The hearing was scheduled. Frank told James, "Bring the post." "The whole thing?" James asked. "The whole thing. Let them see what 88 years looks like." James loaded the post into his truck that morning, wrapped in canvas, soil still clinging to the base. He drove to the courthouse with it leaning against the passenger seat like a tired passenger. The county's zoning ordinance was adopted in 1968. James's farm had been operating, with its structures, fences, and livestock, for 31 years before zoning existed. Frank Petrov explained it simply: if the farm predates zoning, the farm is grandfathered. They can rezone the land on paper, but they can't order the removal of structures that were legal when they were built. James said, "Can I prove when they were built?" Frank said, "Can you prove when that fence was built?" James went to the corner of the property. The original post was still in the ground. It had been there his entire life. As a boy, he'd leaned against it waiting for the school bus. As a teenager, he'd nailed a hand-painted sign to it that read, "Whitfield Farm, Est, 1934. The sign was gone, but the nail holes were still visible. The post stood about 4 feet above ground and went 3 feet below. It was gray cedar, cracked by weather, but solid enough that James couldn't push it with both hands. Near the top, his grandfather Joseph and his great-uncle Martin had carved their initials, J.W. and M.W., and the year 1937. James's father had told him the story 100 times. Joseph and Martin had spent the summer of 1937 fencing the entire perimeter. They cut cedar from the back 40, split each post by hand, sharpened the ends with a draw-knife, and drove them into the ground with a sledgehammer and a level. At every corner, Joseph carved the initials and the year. "So no one ever forgets who was here first," he'd said. James dug the corner post out himself. It took 2 hours and a pry bar. The base was dark and damp, but intact. Cedar resists rot better than almost any other wood. He loaded it into his truck and brought it to Frank's office. Frank examined the carvings. "These are deep, done with a chisel, not a knife." Consistent with 1930s hand tools, he sent a section of the post to a dendrochronologist at the State Forestry Department. The growth rings confirmed the cedar was cut between 1935 and 1938. "Here's the key," Frank said. "The county zoning ordinance was adopted in 1968. This fence post was in the ground 31 years before zoning existed. Your barn was built in 1939. Your equipment shed was added in 1952. Everything on your farm was legal when it was built, because there was no code to violate." James looked at the post leaning against Frank's wall. "So the fence post proves the whole farm. The fence post proves the farm was here first." "And first is everything in property law," Frank said. "Can you prove when that fence was built?" James went to the corner of the property. The original post was still in the ground. Frank filed a defense based on pre-existing non-conforming use. The legal principle that structures and land uses established before a zoning code cannot be retroactively eliminated by that code without just compensation. Collier's attorneys argued that the rezoning was valid. The structures were non-conforming, and the county had the authority to enforce removal. Frank hired a dendrochronologist from the forestry department. She examined the fence post and dated the cedar to 1935 to 1938. The carving was consistent with 1930s era hand tools. He also pulled county records. The zoning ordinance was adopted March 14, 1968. The Whitfield farm had been operating since 1934, 34 years before zoning existed. The morning of the hearing, Collier arrived with his architect and a rolled rendering of the outlet mall. A reporter asked about James's objection. "I respect the farmer," Collier said. "But zoning is the law. When the board rezones a property, everything on it has to comply. That's how development works in America." Inside, he arranged his materials and told his attorney. He brought a stick. "We brought a $47 million project." Now the final hearing had arrived. The board chairman opened proceedings at 9:05 a.m. Collier's team presented the rezoning approval, the economic impact study, the 60-day removal timeline. The architect unrolled a rendering. It was impressive. "The rezoning is lawful, the structures are non-conforming, and the removal order is within the board's authority," counsel summarized. The chairman turned. "Defense." Frank stood. "One exhibit. One fence post." James stood. He picked up the fence post and carried it to the front of the room. He laid it flat on the hearing table. Soil crumbled off the base onto the polished surface. The board members leaned forward. The carved initials, J.W. and N.W., and the date, 1937, were visible from 10 feet away. Collier stared. His architect lowered the rendering. Frank pointed to the carvings. "This fence post was driven into the ground in 1937 by Joseph Whitfield and his brother Martin. Their initials are carved here. The date is carved here. This post stood at the corner of the Whitfield farm for 88 years. He looked at the board. "This farm didn't start last year. It started before most of the people in this room were born." Collier's attorney scribbled a note. The gallery murmured. Frank placed a single-page report. Dendrochronological analysis dates this cedar to 1935 to 1938. The tool marks are consistent with hand forging from that era. This is not a reproduction, it is an original structure element from the 1930s. One board member removed his glasses. Frank placed a second document. The county zoning ordinance was adopted on March 14, 1968. The Whitfield farm, with its barn, its sheds, its fences, and its livestock, had been operating for 34 years before zoning existed. He paused. Under state law, pre-existing agricultural use established before a zoning code cannot be retroactively eliminated by that code. The board cannot order the removal of structures that were legal when they were built, because there was no code to violate. Collier stood. "This is a fence post." "Sit down, Mr. Collier," the chairman said. The room went still. Frank placed one final document. And even if the board could rezone, even if grandfathering didn't apply, State Statute 44-7201 requires just compensation for any government action that effectively destroys the economic use of a property. The $1.2 million offered by Mr. Collier is a purchase offer, not government compensation. The county offered nothing. He placed his hand on the fence post. No compensation was offered. No heritage assessment was conducted. No grandfathering analysis was performed. This fence post proves the farm predates every legal instrument being used to destroy it. The hearing room didn't make a sound. Collier sat motionless. His rendering lay rolled on the table. His $47 million project had just met an 88-year-old fence post. The board chairman conferred with 2 members. It took less than 3 minutes. "The structure removal order is vacated," he said. "The board finds that the Whitfield farm qualifies as a pre-existing non-conforming use under state law. Rezoning remains on record but cannot be enforced against existing agricultural structures without just compensation." He looked at Collier. "The project can proceed on the parcels that have already sold, but Mr. Whitfield's 73 acres are not available." The gavel came down once. Outside, a neighbor who had sold his own farm to Collier 2 years earlier was waiting on the steps. His face was complicated. "You kept your land with a fence post," he said. James shook his head. "My grandfather kept the land in 1937. You just didn't know I'd need the proof," a reporter asked. "Were you worried?" James looked at the post still inside on the hearing table. "That post has been in the ground through droughts, floods, 3 ice storms, and a tornado in '88. It held the fence up for 88 years. He paused. "I figured it could hold up one more morning." 10 months later, Collier's outlet mall was built on the adjacent parcels, scaled down from the original plan. The Whitfield farm sat at the edge of the development, 73 acres of pasture surrounded by parking lots and storefronts. Shoppers sometimes stopped to watch the cattle. James went back to work. The 73 acres stayed in the family. That summer, his grandson helped him reset the corner post, the original carved JW and MW, 1937, back into the ground where it had stood for nearly 9 decades. And the post stood there still at the corner of the property, initials facing east toward the morning sun. Right next to a new post his grandson had carved with his own initials and the year 2026.